Well, we're certainly gratified at this tremendous turnout for this important discussion, but this, as important as it is only the second most important thing today. This is the important thing right here. Okay, go Sox! I'm Paul Grogan, president of the Boston Foundation, and I am delighted to see so many people here this morning for this important discussion. I see many familiar faces, but for those of you who may be here for the first time, the Boston Foundation is Greater Boston's community foundation, a 103-year-old charity that has distributed over its life over $2 billion in grants to Boston area nonprofits working in a wide variety of fields, including, of course, education. This morning, we're going to be talking about, in their own words, what school leaders say they need to succeed. And in so doing, we are focusing on one of the absolutely crucial variables in ensuring a good education, which is school leadership, usually in the form of principals and headmasters. There's now a wealth of research showing very strong connections between the strength of that leadership and the academic performance of the children in their charge. So exploring this through this local survey and seeing how things shake out vis-a-vis the national data, I think will be a very interesting part of this morning. This survey was undertaken with the strong support and partnership of our good friends at Strategic Grant Partners and the Lynch Family Foundation. We thank them very much for their involvement and all they are doing on education reform in Boston. This study and the conversation we'll have today builds on our efforts to elevate and highlight stakeholder voice, especially school leaders, and to advocate for system changes that will empower and equip them to effectively lead their schools. As a foundation, our goal for a long time has been to support the expansion of school-based decision-making, which we believe is a necessary step to increase the number of schools with the conditions for success for all students. This study and the next steps that come from it will build on our efforts to date. The Boston Foundation is committed to exploring and supporting strategies that will improve partnerships and input between the schools and the central office, and we recognize the importance of understanding what supports our school leaders say they need. Empowering these leaders and strengthening the central office itself can position them to act as an even more powerful lever for broader societal change. We hope that this study helps to spur a citywide conversation about how Boston can most effectively support our school leaders. To take us into the program, I'm now pleased to introduce Elizabeth Pauley, our Senior Director for Education. Elizabeth.
I forgot my baseball hat, but I do have one, and I will be wearing it later. Thank you, Paul. I'm pleased to join Paul and the Boston Foundation in adding my welcome to all of you for being here this morning. We are delighted to be able to host this event and to have undertaken this survey with Strategic Grant Partners and the Lynch Foundation. As many of you know, our work in K-12 has focused on creating the conditions for successful schools, which we believe starts with empowering schools, principals, teachers, to make decisions and design programs that are tailored to the specific needs of the students in that school. We have focused on this structural reform as a critical start to creating and expanding the kinds of schools where students are supported and prepared to succeed. If autonomy is a necessary precondition, though, we know that the next step is a focus on people. So another important lever is to focus on the leaders of these schools. And I was reminded of this last week. I was at a conference and I heard a presentation from researchers from the Fred Rogers Center. And their message was, if we are to help children succeed, we cannot skip the adults in the middle. And it was a good summary of why we did this survey and why we think it's so important to hear principal voice and to understand what principals want and need from their central office partners. In a moment, I will invite Katrina Borowick and Tara Goldman, both from Boston College, to the stage to take you through the survey. We are so grateful that they undertook this survey at what was a very busy time of year. Their full bios are attached to your agenda, so if you would like to read about all that they bring to this, research, please feel free to do so. We're very grateful also for the principals who took the time to take this survey in June, which, as you know, is a busy time for principals. So I'll leave it to Katrina and Tara to tell you more about the findings of the survey and the analysis that they have done, but I did just want to call your attention to a couple of things on the agenda. So immediately following Tara and Katrina, there'll be a panel of education leaders led by Jen Colasacco from the Lynch Leadership Academy. Jen will introduce all of our panelists, and again, their full bios are available at your seat. Following their conversation, Commissioner Jeff Riley, who's the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education, will give us closing remarks and comments. And so we think we have set up a very interesting and engaging conversation for all of you about the importance of and understanding the role of principals. And so with that, I will invite Katrina and Tara to take the stage. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Katrina, as Elizabeth said. So in June of this past summer, we sent out a principal survey to 350 principals from the greater Boston area. These principals included Boston Public School principals, Lynch Leadership Academy former students or current students, Catholic school principals, as well as charter school principals. Principals had about 4 weeks to complete the survey, and those who completed it received a $10 Amazon gift card. So among those 350 people that we sent it to, we received 146 responses. So that represents about a 42% response rate. We were very happy with that because, as Elizabeth said, it was at the end of the summer, and end of the school year, and principals were very busy at that time of the year. So we were very pleased with that. And we also received a fairly representative number of principals from different types of schools. So as you can see, the green bar there represents principals from traditional district schools. The light green represents principals from autonomous BPS schools, which include the pilot schools, the innovation schools, and the Horace Mann schools. And the blue bar represents the Commonwealth Charter schools. The red is the diocesan parish Catholic schools, and the purple is the private Catholic schools, and the orange is the standalone Commonwealth Charter schools. So you can see that's fairly representative. One thing to note going forward is that most of these questions about the effectiveness of the central office were not asked of the private Catholic schools and the standalone Commonwealth Charter schools because of their differences in the structure of those schools. So the people that are in the bottom two bars there, you can they're not included going forward. So that's just something to keep in mind, that the total sample size does drop once those people are gone. So as you can see with the dark blue bar moving to the second chart, so 82% of people completed the entire survey, but there was a small proportion that didn't complete the entire survey. And then again, moving all the way over to the right chart, you can see that there's a decent representation of principals from a wide variety of schools, including elementary, middle, and high schools, as well as mixed schools that include multiple grade spans. Another thing to think about moving forward is that in our analyses, we combine the traditional district schools with the autonomous BPS schools, and we did that after analyzing the data separately for both of them and seeing that they were generally comparable. And then since the autonomous BPS schools only had 13 principals, we thought it would be better to combine them rather than leaving a small sample on its own. Along that same line, please keep in mind as you're interpreting the results that the sample size for the Commonwealth Charter schools was only 7. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so principals were asked to report how much time per week they spent interacting with the central office and how productive those interactions were. And while we know that there's a bit of a difference between the services provided in, for example, the central office in Boston versus the Catholic schools and others, our survey provides a general sense of how perceptions of services vary across school types. So When asked how much time per week they spend interacting, most principals spend 6 hours or fewer interacting. So the green bars there represent principals reporting 6 hours or 5 hours or less. Moving over to the right-hand side, the principals reported that the productivity of their offices, and as you can see, the purple bars represent the proportion of principals reporting that the customer service was extremely productive or moderately, I'm sorry, not the customer service, the productivity was extremely or moderately productive. So those purple bars show that across school types, there is variation in how productive the interactions with the central office are. Okay, so schools were also asked to rate the effectiveness of a variety of service areas. So when you're looking here at this graph, the green bars represent principals who rated the service as highly or moderately effective, whereas the red bars represent principals who rated the service as moderately ineffective or highly ineffective. So as you can see across all service areas, 60% of principals rated the service as 60% or more of principals rated the service as highly or moderately effective. The service was most effective in the area of student data and accountability, for which 82% of principals rated the service as highly or moderately effective, and least effective with respect to student support services, where 64% of principals rated the service highly or moderately effective. So moving to this next chart, the chart below displays differences in principals' ratings of service effectiveness across school type. So the green bars here represent the traditional or autonomous district schools. The blue bars represent the Commonwealth Charter schools that are part of a network, and the red bars represent the diocesan parish Catholic schools. So the bars represent the proportion of respondents who rated the service as highly or moderately effective. So as you can see, looking across all of these service areas, in general, the principals from traditional district schools and autonomous BPS schools are less likely to rate their service provider as highly or moderately effective.
Okay, good morning. So we also wanted to just show you some of the actual comments that principals noted in the survey, which you can see up on the screens. I think these comments provide an interesting flavor for how principals are thinking about the supports they receive from their central offices. And these comments also support the quantitative analysis that Katrina provided. The comments shown here also reflect the variation in how principals perceive the quality of the services they're receiving from the central office. As Katrina mentioned, while we know that supports received by different schools may vary, the survey didn't take that into account. So on this slide, the top comments relate to traditional and district schools, all from Boston. The first two comments note that there are many different types of schools and that the central office is trying to support and that these differences make it hard for one central office to understand and serve all schools well. The third bullet provides a suggestion from one principal that perhaps partially decentralizing the central office may help, and a fourth notes a desire from one principal for continued support in areas such as transportation, food services, and athletics, but a desire to have more input as those decisions are being made. And you also note at the bottom from the Catholic schools that there's a general dissatisfaction with the resources that they're receiving from their central office.
All right, so principals were also asked to provide us information about their current service provider in each of the service areas, as well as their preferred service provider. So if you look at this chart there's 9 different service areas, and each one has 2 bars. The bar on the left is the current provider, while the bar on the right is the preferred service provider. Looking at the colors, the darkest orange represents principals who reported that the service was provided by the central network office, but without principal input, whereas the light orange was principals who reported that the central office provides the service, but they asked for principal input when providing it. The light blue represents the school providing the service, but with support from the central office. The sort of medium blue there is the school partnering with an external service provider, and the dark navy blue is the school or the parish providing the service independently, and the gray is not applicable. So looking across these bar charts, you can sort of consider the oranges as being more centrally controlled, whereas the blues represent more school level control. And in general, principals would like more input in their school services. So even when they want the central to have more input, or they want the central office to maintain control, they want to have more input. So if you look at the academic and professional learning, for example, you can see that the proportion of orange stays roughly the same, but the dark orange is getting smaller. So that means, they want to keep it in the central office, but they want to have input in the service. The one area where we saw that the principals wanted especially more input was facilities management. As you can see, most of the highest proportion of them currently report that the central office provides it without any input. And interestingly, in the community and family engagement area, principals would like more support from the central office. So it seems like these principals with community and family engagement have almost too much responsibility, and so they want some help.
So the principal comments here seem to also reflect their frustration with the state of their facilities and then also ideas for improving community and family engagement. On facilities, the principals express comments like their facilities are a mess and that they don't have adequate resources to support their facilities. And then other principals also suggested that they'd benefit from guidance and support on best practices for family engagements, and some also indicated that providing more school-based employee support to support community and family engagement would be beneficial to their buildings.
Okay, so in this next chart, principals were asked to evaluate the customer service orientation of the central office. So the darker blues represent responses that are associated with more highly customer service oriented. So the darkest blue is extremely customer service oriented, the medium blue is moderately, the light is somewhat, and then the gray is not at all customer service oriented. So you can see that in general, the traditional districts and autonomous BPS principals rated the customer service orientation of the central office as less customer service oriented.
Okay, so principals also noted the inconsistencies in their customer service from the central office in their comments. You can see from these comments that some principals are under the impression the central office staff don't view their jobs to support principals, and that some thought that their service was better to the extent that they knew folks within the central office. So, and then still others noted the good work of the central office and the efforts that are being put in there.
Okay, principals were also asked to say how important it was for them to have autonomy. So as you can see, again, to remind you, the dark green represents the traditional or autonomous district schools, the blue is the Commonwealth Charter, and the red is the diocesan parish schools. So regardless of the type of school that the principal represents, they feel that autonomy is extremely or very important. This is especially true with respect to human resources and academic and professional learning. So in this chart, principals were asked their current level of autonomy and their ideal level of autonomy. So the first row of charts represents the proportion of principals across school type who indicated that they currently have total or some autonomy in the area, whereas the bottom row represents the ideal level of total or some autonomy in the area. So even though principals are saying that autonomy is very important, you can see that they don't have the level of autonomy that they would like to have in their schools. So this chart here displays the gap between the ideal levels of autonomy and the current levels of autonomy. So essentially, if you look at, for example, the first green bar, the 17%, that means that there's a 17 percentage point gap in principals' ideal total or sum autonomy compared to their current autonomy. So looking across all of these service areas, you can see that the principals from traditional or autonomous district schools felt that there was the biggest gaps in their services, in their autonomy, with respect to school services, and that gap is the highest with respect to finance. Another interesting thing that I noted in this chart is that while the Catholic school principals are generally satisfied with the level of autonomy, they actually would like less autonomy with finance. So that was really interesting. So in general, across these areas, this autonomy data reinforces the prior slides that showed that principals would like to have more input and control with respect to their school services. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jen Colasacco. I'm the Executive Director at Lynch Leadership Academy. We are a center at Boston College in collaboration with both the Carroll School of Management and the Lynch School of Education. And our mission is to continually increase the capacity of school leaders, principals and aspiring principals throughout Massachusetts to improve student outcomes and disrupt inequities in their schools and in the system to transform our school communities across the state. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our program and our work with all three sectors, leaders from which are represented on our panel today. We focus most of our work on an intensive 14-month fellowship for both sitting principals and aspiring principals. We're currently in our 8th cohort of leaders. That means that we have, at this point, 191 either alumni of our program or current fellows. That's over 35% of the principals in the Boston Public Schools, and a significant number of principals across both the charter and Catholic school sectors across the state, and a significant number of principals outside the city of Boston itself. We actually have partnerships and have alumni or current fellows from over 16 cities and towns across the Commonwealth, from as far west as Holyoke up through Lawrence, Danvers, Salem, and down to New Bedford and Fall River. So it's really exciting work to see what's happening in schools in each of the sectors and how building a cohort of leaders who come together and collaborate and learn with and from each other can really have an impact on the day-to-day experience of faculty and students and families in all of our school communities. We focus on three central aspects of school leadership: instructional leadership, executive management, and equity. And we combine a very intensive amount of professional development with individualized one-on-one coaching for each fellow. So the professional development happens monthly, and then each fellow has multiple meetings per month on site at their school, targeted to their leadership needs and their school context, so that we can have brought the learning with them from the professional development experience right into their schools and have an immediate impact. We work, as I mentioned, in all three sectors, so Catholic schools, charter schools, and traditional district public schools across the city. And we are also continuing our work with our alumni, of which there are many, having professional development for alumni, coaching for alumni, and also offering micro academies, which is more of a focused experience for leaders across the state, which has increased the number of participants in our program by more than 50 school leaders this year. We are really committed to being a part of this conversation of what increases the ability of principals to be effective in transforming the outcomes for our students, and also continues to make the job sustainable. We know how incredibly important and yet how incredibly challenging being a principal can be. And so when we balance autonomy and support for principals, that is a key piece of ensuring that they're able to continue to do the job and do it well. which in turn, of course, leads to improved outcomes for all of our students. So I am very honored and excited to be here with you this morning and to be talking with the fantastic school leaders that we are going to bring to this conversation. I'll introduce them to you by name and role. As Elizabeth mentioned, their bios are in your folder, as is mine. So I'm going to ask them to join me here on the stage. Veronica Conforme is the Chief Executive Officer of Up Education Network. Nick Cuomo is the principal of St. John Paul II Catholic Academy, Neponset. Jabari Petty is the principal of Match Community Day Charter School. And Emily Kozelbosch is the Chief Human Capital Officer at Boston Public Schools. Please come join me. Wonderful. So thank you all. We are just going to get started hearing from all of the panelists. Just your general response and reactions to the very rich results that Tara and Katrina presented to us. So as leaders at the district, school, and network level respectively, please share with us what stood out for you from these results. What resonated with you? What would you have expected before you've seen it? And what perhaps surprised you? Why don't we start with Emily and come this way?
Sure. My name is Emily Kozelbosch. When I'm speaking to you wearing 3 different hats. I am currently the Chief Human Capital Officer in Boston Public Schools, so that hat is about being part of the leadership team of Interim Superintendent Peril. I'm also heading up Human Capital, so I'll talk to you from that department's perspective. While I have not been a school leader, I have been a teacher, and I also come to this work with a deep respect for the incredibly hard jobs of teacher and principal in schools, and believing that we need to empower school leaders and get the most amount of resources to the school level. So I think nothing was overly surprising to me from the BPS perspective in the survey, although I'm interested in diving into some of the nuances. It is alarming that 58% of respondents in the traditional school, in the buckets that I could most identify with, do not see their interactions with central office as productive. And that is alarming, given that even if they're spending 5 or 6 hours a week to get what they need to lead their schools, the fact that those are not productive hours is something that we need to change. I think there's variability. I think we also saw that across the survey in the way that central office departments interact with school leaders. I think that's due to a couple different factors. One is sometimes responsiveness, which school leaders are not getting from all departments, has to do with a mindset issue, frankly, that we have not yet addressed across the board, that we are there to serve students and, school leaders. Sometimes that responsiveness is because central office folks are underwater. Sometimes there are relationships that you saw in the survey in some of the qualitative responses that this is very much relationship driven. And we've had turnover both at the superintendent level over the last 10 years and also in central office. And that makes it very hard for school leaders to get what they need sometimes. So I'd say that that's my first reaction. I'm looking forward to more conversation.
Good morning. My name is Jabari Petty. The piece of data that stood out to me the most was the number about family engagement and how much more support the variety of schools wanted from their central office teams in terms of engaging families. I think specifically to my network and my school and how that is an initiative this year, which is family engagement. And when I trace that to the nucleus, that work falls on the teachers and the amount of outreach, phone calls, communication, the various modes that they have to do to connect with our families. And I'm thinking about what work can be done at the leadership level, what work can be done at the central office level to better engage families so that they can really see themselves as true partners in this work. And we can, of course, have a very long conversation about how intricate and how necessary it is for families to be involved in the achievement of our students. But just thinking about how much more development there has to be done in that particular area is a real interest and a real concern of mine.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Cuomo. I represent St. John Paul II Catholic Academy in Dorchester, Massachusetts. I keep mentioning to the central office I want less autonomy in finances. I'm glad that the data is finally showing that. What really struck me in this research was how little time my colleagues and I actually interact with the central office, with 56% or 54% less than an hour speaking with the central office, and yet we're very happy with the services that we're receiving from the central office. And I do have to say from my own personal interactions is that I do feel supported. I feel like I have a personal connection with the central office, and St. John Paul is part of a network of campuses, and so we have a central office within our own Catholic school. But it also, I guess, sparks interest and sparks dialogue as to we do still have needs that are not being met, whether they are student services or enrollment or academics, that I feel maybe we should kind of be able to take a deeper look as to if there are sectors that are having more dialogue, how can we engage in more dialogue to benefit the needs that we know aren't being met right now? So I think that's really kind of lending a lens for us to engage in that conversation.
Good morning. So a couple of things. This survey reminded me, I spent a decade in New York City helping to reform the central office as a main part of my role, and we would do this survey 3 times a year and get very similar results. Over time, it got better, but it was really a concerted effort from the central office to say we are accountable for schools and their outcomes. And that changed the conversation. When the survey results became the accountability for which we measured our success and the success of every leadership person on the leadership team of a district or of a network, that started to shift the conversation about, oh, and I'm also accountable for student achievement results. So you start to see your role differently. It was a lot of retraining. Central offices and bureaucracies quickly become about power and position and not about service. And really shifting that mindset of a team was I think, one of our biggest challenges, but we made a lot of headway. People understood in the largest school system in the country that if you weren't constantly thinking of your customer as the school, as the principal, that you were not going to be successful in our organization. And that really started to shift the perspective and the service quality. That's on the results. I'm not surprised. I'm also not surprised that student support services and family engagement being sort of the more messy parts, the parts that really take a definitive strategy, that take enough resources. Student supports is a challenge, and if you don't have enough funding, if you don't have enough supports for students who are most in need, that becomes the thing that becomes a pain point for schools because they are struggling to just meet the needs. And so both of those things I found interesting, but unfortunately not surprising. And I think that that some of the desire for input is really about, can there be a shift in the way we do business for school leaders?
Veronica, I'd love to follow up with something you just said about the sense of accountability on the central office team that you were speaking about in New York, and ask you how you've brought that viewpoint to the network of schools you lead now.
Yeah.
So at Up Education, you have 6 schools. Your mission is to work with schools that have been chronically underperforming and transform them. How have you brought that sense of accountability? How do you think the central office of Up Education operates under that principle? And how have you continued to strike that balance that you just spoke about?
Yeah, so I would say a little more than a year in. It has been, for me, it's been an exploration. It's getting to know Boston, but it's also getting to know the organization. And I think that luckily, the organization is a very data-driven organization, so we do this survey 3 times a year as well, and are able to quickly respond. I think in a smaller organization, an organization of 1 million kids, more difficult to respond, and it takes a little longer to shift the systems. In a smaller organization, you can more easily respond to attracting the right leaders. I think pivotal to all of this is who is the person that day-to-day supports the principal. That principal manager, or whatever you call them in a system, assistant superintendent, et cetera, becomes the person that that interprets for the schools, that becomes the liaison for the school. If you don't have very strong people in that role, it is principals often feel disempowered as well.
Thank you. Nick and Jabari, I'd love to turn back to you for a moment and appreciate what you shared regarding both the family engagement, Jabari at Match, and the initiative there, and Nick mentioning the finances, but also the sort of overall satisfaction that you feel with the relationship. And I'm wondering if you guys could each expound on that a little bit more. A couple of examples of what is working well, as you're each part of different networks within your school type, as you mentioned. From your experience, what is the most effective example of the collaboration between the school leader and the network office in your school systems, and what makes that effective, and how could it serve as a model for other aspects of the work? Whichever one of you would like to answer first, and then the other, please.
Similarly to Nick, I have an incredible relationship with our central office team. I think one thing that has made me feel emboldened and empowered is how much they trust my leadership, and how much they trust our team, my leadership team's ability to make decisions. They really believe that we are the experts for student achievement, and that is translated to the rest of my team and the rest of our school. So we operate with like a sense of pride, and we operate with a sense of purpose. But I think just their trust in us what has allowed us to effectively operate. They give us a lot of autonomy over a variety of aspects in our school. In many cases, too much at some points. But it is almost as simple as saying, like, I want to level all the books in my classroom libraries. I need that done by tomorrow, and it will effectively be done by tomorrow. They will employ all the resources that they have across the network, across the schools, to ensure that the leveling of these classroom libraries is happening, and expeditiously, because they believe that this decision is the thing that's going to move the needle forward. So the autonomy that they've given us has felt very, very liberating in many aspects. And one thing that my team, my collective team, and I are curious about is how does autonomy equate to achievement? And in many cases, we can make the argument that the more autonomous a school is, the higher achievement that we're seeing on state assessments.
Thank you.
I support a lot of what Jabari was sharing about feeling autonomous and feeling that trust from the central office, that trust in my school leadership and trust in my team, that I know my community and my scholars in the best capacity. I know what their needs are. I would also add on the element that really fuels a strong partnership is the opportunity for open and honest dialogue and feedback, and being able to proactively be part of a conversation that might either be starting off at the school-based level, or maybe from a district level, and just having a voice or an understanding of where is this decision coming from, so that this way I know how to communicate that to my team, my community, or I can advocate for my community in a forum that my voice is being heard, and not just being heard, but also listened to. And I think I see that the CSO as well.
Yeah, Emily, please.
So I would love to respond to something Jabari just said, which is about connecting autonomy to outcomes, positive outcomes for students, which I think is the key. When we think about, for lack of a better verb, granting autonomy, we need to think about it carefully. Where does school leader voice intersect with the research and what we know is good for students? And can I give two examples? One, which I know very well, work that I have been part of for 5 years, which is granting to all 125 Boston Public Schools the autonomy, this site-based decision-making around hiring teachers. This is something that we knew from research is the most important school-based predictor of student success is the quality of the teacher. And school leaders were saying, this is an incredibly hard job. I cannot do it unless I do not have a choice of the teachers I have. So this is a massive sea change across all 125 schools, something that principals had been telling us that they wanted autonomy in hiring. We saw the results in the survey that it's important to them. They still want more. And we are working to actively, through some contract negotiations with our secretaries union, through work we're doing with our assistant principals, really kind of digging in so that we can continue to give school leaders the autonomy that they want there, because it really matters for student outcomes. Something I saw in the survey too is that the largest gap for our schools, we were not in the red, like you guys were at the -2% of wanting less autonomy with finances. Our school leaders are asking for more autonomy over their budgets. Boston Public Schools spends over $20,000 per pupil, which is high. And despite that, school leaders still feel that they do not have say over how those resources are used. And this happens for a few reasons. One is that we choose as a district leadership team to essentially hold on to a small number of dollars to fund initiatives that the leadership team believes are crucial to student success. One of them is around hiring, some around professional development. But the bigger explanation for why school leaders do not have the discretion that large green bar is saying that they want are often structural and outside of our control for right now. Some of those reasons are around our high teacher salaries with an average approaching about $100,000. Very important to pay for quality teachers, but also a large expense that then takes away from the pot of money that school leaders can move around. We're under a consent decree by the Department of Justice, which requires our schools, our school leaders, our teachers to serve every single student who walks through their building, regardless of home language. Also, something that we value for inclusion and equity also requires a large number of programs and staffing configurations at the school that, again, school leaders can't move pieces around for. Finally, also, our student assignment system requires that we provide programming at all 125 schools that is there to support, again, every student who walks through our doors. Again, we want to do that, and it costs money. So we do believe that budget transparency is incredibly important, and we're working this year to provide even more detail to our school leaders about how much we're spending on which services. We can then match that with surveys such as this one and surveys that we do internally to find out what school leaders are saying that they want, need, and then we can make adjustments from there.
Thank you. Could actually follow up on what you're saying around responding to the data and how you're choosing to expend the resources you do have in response. Are there changes that you are envisioning from these results, or that you feel like have been made recently that align with these results, which you said weren't necessarily surprising to you and your colleagues? So I know there's been some structural changes in the district this year.
So sure. So I'd give three quick examples. One is that we were hearing from school leaders last year that the way that we had schools grouped in what were being called teaching and learning teams, roughly the same size, reporting to one academic superintendent, not grouped for specific kind of common problems of practice, that wasn't working, that their relationship with central office was not effective. So over last spring, we reorganized to give schools that need more resources from the central office lower performing schools, put them in smaller groups, gave them specific access to central office supports, and this is kind of a work in progress. That was a structural change in response to school leader voice. Our interim superintendent, Laura Peril, came in with a focus on listening to school leaders. Spent the summer she talked to about 72 school leaders in small sessions. From those high-level themes, has made some changes at central office already in terms of structures and personnel. And we also have done our own survey that looks at the perception of school leaders of department by department, which services are seen as crucial to your success as school leaders, and which of those services are delivered effectively or not.
Thank you. Veronica, I'd like to come back to you with a question. Sort of circling back to the idea of the mission of Up Education and knowing that you work in schools that are in need of turnaround. Does the fact that they're in need of turnaround and the sort of research around what effective turnaround might be, or the conditions within those schools, how does that factor in to the way you determine autonomy levels for your schools? Both in what ways do schools and school leaders have autonomy, and to what degree? How does that correlate to what we know about working in turnaround schools, and how does Up view that and make those decisions?
Yeah, we are in the process of actually developing a school model that is specific to turnaround. It means we have a network of schools. We have 6 schools across the state of Massachusetts. So in these autonomy conversations, there is always a balance between how do you pick something that's going to allow us to become experts at a particular curriculum, at a particular approach. Really sort of sharing our leadership development work across the network. It's a balance between doing that and then giving an individual school an ability to move. Every turnaround environment is not exactly the same. So there is some context in our communities. Our schools in Lawrence are different from our schools in Boston and our school in Springfield. And so we have to take context into account, but we do have an approach. We know that our students, especially in turnaround environments, are coming in 3 and 4 grade levels behind in reading and in math. We know we need intervention. That's not a discussion. That is equity, and that is giving students what they need. We know that we need to have a certain amount of support services in place in environments of high poverty. That is something that we need to do. We know we need social emotional curriculum to support the skills of our students, because oftentimes they are coming with those challenges. Those are not things that we're saying you should pick and choose. Those are things that students actually need. And so when it comes to the needs of students, or when it comes to equity issues, that's where I think autonomy and rubs with how are we prioritizing the needs of students. However, on talent, for example, talent selection, that isn't even a conversation. Leaders have to pick their teams. Every organization works that way. You want to pick folks that are aligned, that are going to work really hard to deliver the type of educational experience that we want our children to have.
Thank you. Some commonality with what Emily was saying. Jabari, Nick, I have another question for you. Sort of asking you to sit in the space of, so you're a principal, and in the role in this survey was to be responding to your experience with support services and autonomy, what you would like, what the gap might be, et cetera. How does, if you think about that role in the middle, right, because then you are then the leader of your faculty, right, of your team of teachers, how does can you apply your own experience and how you feel about autonomy to then how you give autonomy to your teachers? And does reflecting on the results of this survey in any way give you a new insight or new perspective, or do you see any mirror or parallel between what you experience as a leader from your central office and what your team of teachers might experience from your leadership?
I found that speaking directly to my own leadership or with my own team, and how I'm giving autonomy to my own staff. And so that, am I communicating the same level of trust in their classrooms? And is my presence in their classrooms and the conversations geared towards the students, geared towards the different supports that our staff members need? Because I thought one of my most important roles is to choose my own team and being able to bring in those members, and then throughout the school year making sure that they're reminded that they do have that support, but at the same time making sure that there's alignment as well to the mission of the school and the mission of the Archdiocese. And I think sometimes it really depends on the level of experience of staff sometimes too, because you have to differentiate those supports. Many times in the Archdiocese we are getting a lot of first-year teachers joining our schools, and they need to feel that level of support from their school leader. But at the same time, I think there needs to be a constant touch point where there is an alignment of what does it look like in the classroom? What does it look like in a parent communication? What does it look like at a family engagement event? So that what we're saying as a campus and as a school is happening in individual classrooms and happening in the Archdiocese as well.
Thank you.
I would say one thing that is another area in which we've been provided almost absolute autonomy is with the hiring of our teams. We go through a pretty extensive and rigorous identification and onboarding process in terms of staff that we are bringing into our teams. Given how thorough that vetting process is, when we have identified a person to work alongside us and lead our children, we trust them. We trust in their abilities. We trust that they are aligned, as Nick was saying, and we lead with that notion of trust. And so we allow them the flexibility to do the art, to do the masterful things that they do in their classrooms. We observe, of course. We provide feedback. We develop collectively, and that is to create this vision of alignment. And the way that we protect this alignment is through empowering teacher leadership, identifying teacher leaders. We have a team of grade level leads who flank the left and right of the leadership team. And we develop, we grow together, and that is also how we impart our trust to them, and how we help to protect against this idea of vision alignment. Yeah, I think that's really what it is. It's about leveraging, it's identifying the right people and leveraging their talents to help us continue to be aligned, but also help us to give them to impart that level of trust and autonomy to them.
So there's a real parallel between across all of the sectors and both within the schools and within the systems to really invest in talented teams and to give everyone at their level of leadership real autonomy and input in bringing the right people on board. Let's talk a little bit more about other types of opportunities for that level of both trust and collaboration. I was struck by the results that Katrina specifically pointed out around the dark orange, light orange, that there was a desire for an increased collaboration and mutual input between central office and school leaders, as opposed to, I want this all by myself, or I want this totally given to me in many areas. This idea of partnership and collaboration, I'd love to hear from each of you what your take on that is. What opportunities do you see? Where do you think that's most important? Where is the next logical place that could happen immediately, or you think that should happen? Talk to me a little bit about partnerships.
I can start.
Great.
Yeah, I was, it's good to see, because it's not saying there is any one entity in a school system that knows all of the answers. Otherwise, we'd be in a different place collectively. And so it was good to see that it is a collective approach. Picking up on Jabari's point, we are working on teacher leaders and teacher leader voice in our network, and identifying teacher leaders to help us really work through any changes that we would want to implement. Anytime you do a change in a system, everybody sort of braces and they're like, here's another big shift, and I don't know how I'm going to fit into that. And so really thinking through how to leverage teacher leaders on any shift in a curriculum, how to think about professional development, and using leaders. You talked about a cohort of leaders. The cohort of leaders is really bringing leaders together to talk about their own development, but for those leaders that have been doing this work for a longer period of time, that now can contribute differently, helping them shape what the next wave of professional development is for leaders, helping them have voice around what are the right approaches to social emotional learning for kids. They've been doing this for a long time. They need a differentiated role to continue to be invested in doing this work. And so that's some of the work we're doing in our network.
Thank you. Shannon?
Yeah, please.
So I'm itching to talk about our partnership with the University of Virginia. I think this is a good place to do it in terms of partnerships and changing the relationship between school leaders and central office, and also school leaders with each other and teachers in their building. So we have embarked on a partnership with the University of Virginia's School Turnaround Program is what it was called. Most recently, it's a partnership with the Curry School of Education and the Business School down at UVA. They have 15 years of results of working in urban districts and seeing rapid student achievement gains in many, many cases. The pilot is around creating cohesion or coherence among a small group of school leaders that then enables us to more strategically support those schools. So as I talk about this, there's a little bit of giving up of autonomy with the expectation that you'll get more support from the central office. This idea of reciprocal accountability that is becoming very important, and as Veronica said, we can start to measure and hold people accountable too from the central office perspective. But UVA's model is not that you just hire a rock star principal and say, all right, you got this, like let us know in June how things went. It is that we do need to hire rock star principals, but that they do not hold all the answers. They have teachers, and they can work to incorporate their teachers' voice and teachers' leadership. They have administrative teams, their left hands and their right hands. How do they bring them along? How do they teach? How do they learn themselves through UVA? How to do something like a root cause analysis and start to put plans in place for the 3 or 4 high leverage actions they'll take over a year, and how do they implement that at their school level? And then on the central office side, Paul, you said when you were introducing this that you're interested in changing systemic conditions. They require us to change the way we do business in central office to better support schools, which is a beautiful thing. So we are working to think about, they call it the instructional infrastructure, the talent management structures that we have in place, accountability, this idea of two-way accountability. How do we improve our own systems so that we are supporting those school leaders? And then I think this partnership, which is one of the most effective models I've seen of a kind of two-way input, reciprocal accountability partnership, has led to changes in the way that the leaders, the 6 leaders of these schools interact with their academic superintendent, who is in their schools weekly, coaching, ensuring that they are implementing the 90-day plans that they created with their instructional leadership teams, teachers at schools. It has changed the way they've interacted with each other, because in this agreement as school communities to focus on a couple things to get those things right. For example, one of the examples is a focus on adult learning and instructional leadership teams. They can then create resources that they can share with each other. Central office can support with certain data systems, other types of supports that are helpful. And that's also changed their relationship. How do they interact with each other? And then finally, we are better able to support from the central office when we are very clear what they need, They've made it clear through their planning and through their cohort model, and we can be held accountable for delivering on those supports. So I think this idea of choosing to put your eggs in the autonomy basket when it makes sense, and then maybe not doing that where you can get a greater reward in terms of supports, is something that is worth exploring.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just quickly speak to the idea of collaboration? I think saying collaboration is not enough. I think the structures need to be put in place to facilitate a collaborative relationship. By structures, I mean quarterly meetings, quarterly opportunities for central office teams, school leadership teams to meet, to do site visits, to do some professional development, to do walkthroughs, to really diagnose what's happening in the classroom so that central office team leaders can get a sense, can have their thumb really close to the pulse of the schools. They'll help them to make better informed decisions and help them to, I guess if you relinquish some autonomy, but just so that they can more closely see the problem. And I think an easy way for that to happen is to have central office staff members working out of the schools, being really present there, knowing the staff, knowing the students. I think that's how we move towards creating more of a communal feel across the schools and the central office teams. If you read your bios, I had the opportunity to work under Veronica's leadership last year, and one thing that her team did was facilitate these opportunities for collaboration, facilitate these opportunities to really hear what the school leaders had going on, and she would also make herself and her teams available to really know what's going on in the school, know the DNA of the schools. And I think once we are able to do that on a more consistent and structured basis, we'll be able to gain greater parity across the central office teams and our schools, and that'll help to push more towards not so much autonomy, but clarity around what is needed and where should these resources be allocated.
Just like one simple, I'll add, thank you, Jabari. One thing I'll add is our principal meetings are not at a central office. Our principal meetings are at schools. And they're at each school, at each of our networks, so that we can actually observe what's going on. The central office team members go to the school, and then we do walkthroughs, because the value of the principals as a cohort is that they get to give each other feedback.
I think from our perspective, I'll just chime in, is I think we are entering in a space where we have to have a real conversation about giving up part of our autonomy so that we're able to get more support. I think with having 98, 99% autonomy at several Catholic schools, it also leads to 98, 99% ownership of all of those services. And if you're putting all that ownership on a principal's shoulder or an admin's shoulders, it doesn't mean that all the buckets are being filled. And I think we, especially from a Catholic standpoint, is like a large piece of my role and many of our school leaders' roles is enrollment. And having more support and giving up more autonomy with those pieces, I think it allows us to think about our gifts in a more strategic way that supports more students. For example, being able to, for me knowing my school, being able to really focus on supports for family engagement, but knowing that I have the central office's supports for recruitment of new families. And I think that's two sides of the same coin. So I think really understanding from an economy of scales, they have more resources from a larger network, and they're also being able to look at other school leaders. I think sometimes, like our teachers, we sometimes operate in silos. So from a principal standpoint, I can connect different teachers who have different gifts that can share. When a district is able to connect different school leaders that possess different gifts, we're able to learn from each other and benefit our students.
Fantastic. So I think you've all referred to what might be some places that have been successful and alluded to some challenges, but let's illuminate that a little bit. There's clearly a commitment from all of you, with desire and belief in collaboration and partnership and that balance of autonomy from all of you, and also reflected in the survey data. So when we see this gap between what people believe in and want to happen and what's happening, that raises a question around what are some of the challenges that are getting in the way, so we can bring those into the space so we can solve them. So what do each of you see as the main challenge right now for increased collaboration and that right balance of autonomy and support?
I'll say that one of our priorities this year at Match Community Day is to create structures that allow our teachers to be better managers of their time and their energy. And I think about what that means for the work of the leadership team. What work do we have to absorb? What work do we have to better manage ourselves so that we are essentially clearing the path for our teachers so that they can focus majority of their attention on teaching and instructing. And I think the same thing, that same tension exists between leadership teams and central office teams is how do we give our leadership teams, our principals, just enough so that they are allowed to have that flexibility, that clarity of mind to focus on leadership, to focus on curriculum design, to focus on best instructional practices, to focus on developing a sound and stable school culture, while not having to have to worry about all the other bureaucratic red tape that you have to dodge and duck in order to effectively lead your schools. So I think that tension forever exists. It's a matter of us continuing to collaborate and do the investigation to figure out what work streams, how do we better distribute and disseminate work streams across our central office teams and across our leadership teams so that ultimately our teachers have that clarity and can focus on, as I said earlier, doing that art that they do in the classrooms.
And I think at the central office, we need to do for you what you're doing for your teachers, which is to provide clarity about where we can take things off your plate, where there's something that's compliance related that you should not be spending your time on doing, but you need done well. That should be done, and we should be clear about the role of individuals or departments who do that. In places where you need support in implementing your vision around adult learning, around adult mindset, around professional development for your teachers. Specifically in Boston, we're large enough. We have economies of scale. We can provide some of those supports, and we should do that well. I think one of the things, in addition to the kind of change in leaderships that we've had or trust that we need to rebuild, and also the scale that are our challenges, we have not been clear across every department about what that department's function is, and then how you as a school leader or any school leader in our system should experience that. And I think clarity would help school leaders know what they can expect, and then we can also hold people accountable in central office for delivering.
Yeah, I would add trust. I think it's a basic rebuilding of trust that that both the central office team, which interestingly enough, I think the diocese has built a community of trust where I think despite the fact that principals are saying they have a lot of responsibilities, and that may be another challenge, we use our organizational structure is such that we have a director of operations that handles enrollment and other things. It's an interesting model. Many networks do that. That really take off the operation and compliance burden off the principal's plate so that they can focus on academics and instruction. But it's really about, building trust that we all collectively have what's in the best interest of all of our students. And delivering with clarity role, this is what we are expected to deliver. We're gonna measure that, we're gonna hold ourselves accountable to that. So that we can actually deliver outcomes.
Trust, shared vision, and just fluid communication channel. I think sometimes in this, generation or this day and age, it's just so easy to communicate with the central office via email, and I think a lot is lost through those communications. I think having meetings at school sites, so it's really just grounding the work that we're doing, and I think it's connecting the central office back to the decisions, the role that you serve, the gifts that you're sharing, they're having an immediate impact, and I think that helps support that shared vision, and it helps make sure that there's trust there, and productive and effective communication.
Thank you. Before we open to questions, are there any final comments or reactions, anything I didn't ask you about that you'd like to share before we open it up?
No, let's engage the audience.
All right. Well, then we are happy to open it up to you all to ask questions, either of the panelists, also of Katrina and Tara, if you have questions about the data collection in the survey. Yes.
My name is. There's talk out loud.
Oh, that's coming.
Hi.
Can you hear me? That works. Hi. My name is Aylin, and I'm a very early candidate for Boston City Council. And I've spent the summer doing a listening tour, talking to people throughout Boston about what matters most to them. And a lot of people who are my age, so late millennials, early millennials, late Gen Xers, are of the age where they're sending their kids into the school systems. And they're debating whether to stay in the city or leave the city. And a lot of millennials want to stay in the city, and they want to send their kids to public schools because most of them have been there. But they're concerned about, the state of some of the public schools. So what I hear from them is not, we want to ditch the city, go to the suburbs, forget about it. They want to stay and they want to help, but they're not sure how to help. I hear about the amazing work that you're doing. And so what I want to know is, what can we do to help the schools be successful? So it's not just on you, but from the community in general. What can we do to empower and support the BPS?
It's a really good question. It's a really excellent question. I think one of the first things to do is go and visit the schools, so that you can see and begin to know more intimately what some of the challenges are that exist. I would say make yourselves available to volunteer at these different spaces, and then very bootstraps. Like if you see an issue and a persistent issue, I would imagine galvanizing members of your community, go knocking on those doors, make sure you're connecting with the right people to shine a light on some of these trouble spots that are existing across the greater Boston community in our schools. Veronica said it earlier, it's a real equity issue. There are many communities that are lacking and are in need, and when we're looking at the redistribution, or the distribution rather, of resources, it's not always balanced. And I think we need more eyes on that problem, so we can really begin to attack the heart of it. It's not a clean answer, but my recommendation would be to first go and see these schools, to go and see the schools where you want to send your children to, and have those conversations with the principals. I've been very fortunate in this recent experience that I have at my school. I am colleagues with some of the parents of their students, and by virtue of that, I feel more of a sense of responsibility. Those children are my children in that regard, and I think that relationship needs to be fostered, and really, and we need to take advantage of that.
Thank you.
I completely agree. I think people often see schools and they're like institutions that are sort of guarded, et cetera. There are a gazillion ways to contribute. There are community partners that already work with the schools. There are after-school programs, there are reading programs. The more folks that live in the community get invested in, and I'm thinking about our school in South Boston, for example, that want to contribute, that young people want to contribute to, there are a gazillion ways to fit in, and we need it. It's not like we don't have reading programs in the afternoon. We don't have after-school clubs. We don't have a variety of ways for people to come in and support. But the support has to be consistent, because our children need that level of consistency.
And I would emphasize that once community members and parents and families are involved in schools, they should never underestimate the power of a well-articulated suggestion or feedback, because principals take it to heart. Our community engagement team takes it to heart, and people can have a real impact on decisions that are being made when we're in the input phase of rollout. So thank you for the question.
Good morning. My name is Faye Alexander. I teach at a charter school in Cambridge. And my question is around equity and hiring staff and teachers of color that reflects your student body. So what is central office's role? What is your role as leaders in hiring teachers that reflect the population of students that you have at your school?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you start.
No, it is a critical priority for us. I think it is a challenge that is solvable. It has to start earlier. We are now partnered with organizations that start to have conversations with young potential teachers of color in high school and in college, because that's what it will require to like attract people and support them through the process of becoming a teacher for us. And we're really excited about that. And it takes prioritizing it. We have to actually go out and actually do the recruitment. There are places that are doing it better than others, and so we are learning from places that are targeting historically Black colleges. There are places that, and we do that too, and go out and recruit. But it has to be a priority because, and it has to be a priority for your organization.
Yeah, when we instituted the system of mutual consent hiring 5 years ago, when school leaders are now able to select their teachers, that opened the door for us as a human capital office to completely focus on cultivating the candidate pools from which the school-based teams choose. It does start very early. We believe that our future teachers are actually in our classrooms, in our communities. We are lucky. Boston is a beautifully rich, diverse community. We have developed a number of programs so that we can kind of catch people early. We have a new partnership with City Year. Teaching is a very attractive career. It is incredibly hard. I told you I started as a teacher and I carry that with me every day. But it is one where when supported well, when we've compensated teachers well, people can feel really good about what they're doing every day. So I think the role of the central office, once the decision making is pushed down to the school, is to make sure that those schools have amazingly deep, diverse candidate pools.
I think, thank you for that question. I think, I believe, not I think, that the problem, it is an issue. Our schools are not as diverse. They don't always represent the population that they service. But I think it's more than just identification of candidates who are people of color. It's an issue of sustained development and retention thereafter, not just of the leaders, not just of teachers of color, but also the leaders of these teachers of color, because when you look at our leadership teams, we begin to become less integrated. Our leadership teams look more and more homogenous. And there's a gap and dynamic that exists between them and the leadership of their teachers. They're not always speaking the same language. They're not always seeing the same issues. And that rub creates a real friction. And what we notice ends up happening is because they feel so voiceless, our people of color, they end up leaving our schools and going off to other charter schools or going to the suburbs, as you mentioned earlier, or just leaving the field in general. And that's a real issue that I think we need to pay closer attention to. So a lot of it has to do with a lot of DEI work, a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusivity work that needs to happen in terms of developing our leaders so that we can think about sustaining development for our teachers of color and retaining them over time.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly challenging issue that Catholic schools also face. Connecting our educators with our students, and there's definitely a discrepancy in our mix of students and teachers here in the Catholic sector. And I think there's also, we're trying to work with our central office to make sure that we're present in some of these functions, such as a diversity career fair that I know that BPS, and several charter schools all attend, having sectors present there. And I think there's also an added challenge as well with several Catholic schools having a discrepancy in salary and in compensation that we can also offer as well to make sure that Catholic education is accessible to the students that we are serving. So figuring out how do we support the staff members that we want in those classrooms and have those students, not pricing anyone out of that opportunity to be in those classrooms is it's a problem that I'm part of, but it's also a very interesting and very timely conversation that needs to happen in order to support our students.
In front over here, please.
Hi, my name is Barbara Russell. I'm an investor in technology and education technology companies here in Boston. Nick, you had made a comment, and I heard across the board that the ability of principals and teachers to interact with the central command, you said email or in-person visits. And since we live in this ecosystem of ed tech, especially here in Boston, how do you employ state-of-the-art tools like Slack channels, et cetera, to not only interact with Central, but to extract best practices of the best performing schools and the best educators?
Excellent. I think that also depends on what type of technology you have in the classroom or in the building. I'll kind of be honest and transparent. I don't know what Slack means. So that I think in itself speaks a little bit piece of that. We use the communication channels that we have accessible to facilitate a healthy level of communication between the schools and with the central office. But I think when those channels are not present, or maybe we might depend too much on them, then we get into a little bit of a rut, I guess, and where there might be not as much in-person communication or over-the-phone communication, or there might be too many meetings scheduled and we're not actually getting in the classrooms. I think there's definitely a place for technology, especially in the 21st century, but I think that also doesn't take away from this experience of having everyone present in having this dialogue together, as opposed to we could have easily just done a group TED Talk and emailed it to you.
Yes.
Emily, as you know, ever since the appearance of independent charter schools in the state, there has been a proliferation of schools that offer some kind of autonomy within the system. Right. Quite a few at this point, different categories. What is preventing the system from articulating some overall vision or direction about this autonomy movement? Because there is a lot of confusion at this juncture, and I think the demand for autonomies is only going to increase with the inability of independent charters to grow, at least at this point. So where are we headed on this, or where should we head?
We have 42 schools that have some level of autonomy. 9 of them are turnaround, 20 of them are pilots, 6 or 7 are innovation, same number of horseman charters. It leads, and so then those schools have varying levels of autonomy in staffing and budget and governance and all, in the typical areas. The challenge, I think, is there are many challenges, and we could overcome all of them, so that nothing is preventing us from articulating that vision other than just time. We have, in this 124 schools, I think we have this tension between hiring amazing principals who come in with a deep knowledge of often teaching and leading in a school, more than folks in the central office. And we say, okay, here's your school, hire your teachers. We'll give you, 45% of budget autonomy or whatever. I know that wasn't the exact number. We'll give you a little bit of autonomy here, a little bit there, go to it. So we are balancing the vision and the work that the school leader wants to enact, and we have 125 people doing that differently. And the hope with our reorganization, frankly, one of the hopes is that we can have schools grouped around a problem of practice. They are not necessarily grouped around, they are not grouped around which autonomies they have necessarily, some of them are, but that they can around a common area where through deep analysis they know they need to get better at. And we say choose 2 or 3 areas in a year. We can't change everything within a year. Focus on those 2 or 3 things. Get the support you need, and then from those areas, from that learning and sharing resources, and we see them make progress. We will have learned how to shift our kind of ocean liner of central office to better support them. I think the way that I look at autonomy is it is in service of the vision that those schools have. There needs to be a little bit more, in order for us to better support schools, there needs to be a little bit more kind of articulation because we're large in Boston, in smaller groups of schools that are trying to tackle the same sticky problems, and then we can better support them. I don't know if that answers your question. Did you think I was going to articulate that vision right now? Oh, okay. Thank you.
I guess.
Hi, my name's John Gay. I'm the executive director for Playworks, but also a parent of a K-1er in Boston at the Hernandez School. So first, thank you for all the work you're doing to help the kids. I think I know we all know that's the heart of what we do. My question comes back to one of the bigger gaps that was on the data around student support services. I think you all talked a little bit about might be causing that gap, but what's the process of getting educators' voice around finding solutions to that gap and maybe creating more autonomy for schools and school leaders' voice to changing that picture?
Okay, so my answer to your question is going to be grounded in a conversation I had with a good friend who's a teacher in Boston. And again, I think the other panelist articulated it's a kind of mushy, confusing, there could be a lot in there, student support services. And she was talking to me, this was a year or 2 ago, about Boston Public Schools' focus on social and emotional learning. And she had seen us talk about it. She loved the focus. She was a 5th grade teacher. She did not feel that it had yet translated to her teaching in the classroom. And she, as an expert in her field, understood that this student had specific needs. This other student had different needs. And she didn't feel like there was anywhere to turn as a teacher at that level. So I think step 1 is us articulating a focus, putting resources centrally to solve a problem that we see. But the part about translating it to where teachers feel like the resources that we have as a district collectively are things that they can tap into is really challenging. And so I would say that it's that translation from, in our case, large district to the school and the teacher level that needs tightening up. I'd love to know your perspectives, because this is something, when I saw those results, I felt like I needed to know more.
Hard to say what's all in there. When I read student support, I assume support for students with special needs also. And in that arena, I think there are a lot of different components to that. So there is a compliance mechanism that schools often need support around, making sure that all the paperwork and all the documentation is in order. But there's also, there has been a lack around creativity around how to create inclusive environments, oftentimes that rubs against the compliance piece. And at least that's what I found in big, large systems. Like, you could say, I want to create a model that is different. I want to do instead of a 12-student model classroom, I want to do an 8-student model classroom with 3 general, some other combination that oftentimes educators are finding might work better in their context. And given the compliance piece to that becomes really difficult. So, or the way they integrate speech and language services, for example, for students. How to make sure that it's not about minutes, but it's included in the classroom, how to give teachers those tools to be able to do it. So there's a variety of things, I think, that go into that is about like more creativity in the way we approach student support services. But then there's also the compliance piece. And I think those two things, holding those two things is a challenge that we have to help schools unpack.
I would just quickly add that I think it has a lot to do with representation. And what I mean is families of our multilingual learners, families of students with disabilities, families of students who struggle with really big emotional challenges. I think they need to be represented and sitting at the table on parent council leadership teams and having those conversations with the principals, having the conversation with the leadership team, having conversations with central office teams as well. So this population of students has a voice and somebody's advocating for them. And I think a lot of it has to do with what intentional work are the school leadership teams doing to connect and make outreach to those families of students who fall into the categories that we just described.
Yeah, I echo what Jabari was saying. I think there needs to be direct representation at several of these conversations, or create a forum for these conversations if they're not currently existing within the system, because if we're using a linear model of communication, there's going to be delays and the message will actually be changing as it's going all the way up to whoever is owning that piece for student services. So I think we need to kind of bring all the stakeholders or representation of the stakeholder into the conversation.
Over here, please.
Hi, I hope we can be clear about this. I've been harassing Emily in the Boston Public Schools on the issue of diversity for many, many years. And I think that I hear a lot of talk about support for autonomous schools. And I want to raise the question about how do we exercise accountability for the exercise of these autonomous powers. Boston has invested an enormous amount of money, millions and millions of dollars, to get around certain union procedural requirements to give hiring authority to its principals. And the concern I have, having observed this issue around the question of diversity of staff for many years, is that we haven't pushed the needle very much. So what do we do in that circumstance? How do we hold people? And I would say also for early hiring. So how do we exercise diversity? How do we exercise accountability in this kind of system? And I say that with a deep belief in school autonomy and empowerment of schools. But I think those issues of clarity, those issues of reciprocal responsibility and accountability are very key to make sure that the exercise of autonomous authorities are actually in the service of the kids and the goals that we as a society believe in, like teacher diversity. Thanks.
John, you get to hear from me all the time. Would you like to hear from other people first? Why don't we go and then I get to. We're in good conversation. Yeah.
I actually don't think you can have autonomy without accountability. I think that doesn't work. And so but the accountabilities have to be clear. When I worked, I would say when I worked in New York, it was very clear what your accountability was for. It was focused on student outcomes. It was focused on families saying that they felt good about the school and teachers wanting to be there. And those were three big things that we focused on in terms of outcomes and accountability. And with that came a set of empowerment, we call them empowerments, autonomies, whatever you want to call them. It was about talent. It was about using your resources. It was about scheduling. and about creating the types of schedules that meet the needs of students. And it was a belief that at the end of the day, the folks closest to kids, the ones that knows their family names, are the people who should be making those decisions. And that, but it absolutely has to be in exchange for accountability. The second piece, which I talked about earlier, was the system has to be accountable for outcomes for students. It means that as a leader, it didn't matter that I was a chief operating officer, I was accountable for student outcomes. It didn't matter that you were the chief financial officer, it didn't matter that you were the head of data and technology, you are accountable for student outcomes. This is what we do in our organization. And I think that starts to shift both the trust, because now actually schools trust that you are doing it with the same level of accountability and intention.
So,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to really quickly, trust is developed when everybody has a shared outcome, a shared goal in mind. And that shared outcome, that shared goal must absolutely be student achievement. And we must be able to draw a very bold line between all the work that exists in these central office teams, our school teams, to student accountability, to student achievement. And I believe that's how we begin to raise the bar for accountability. And to underscore what Veronica just said, if we are entrusting you to be autonomous, then you are accountable to us for delivering on X. And that X must be student achievement and achieving at wild and rapid rates. And if we are unable to draw a really direct connection between those things, then we need to reassess how we are structuring our schools and reassess how we are structuring our central office teams.
What I'll add to this, John and I do talk often, so the only thing I can say that's new is something I talked about on Friday with two colleagues, one of whom is here, Mary Driscoll, who oversees our elementary schools in Boston, and Colin Rose, who heads up our Opportunity and Achievement Gap work. We've been working for a number of years, specifically in this area of being clear with school leaders about the importance of having a teaching staff that reflects the rich diversity of their students. Currently in Boston, we have 87% of our students identifying as students of color and 38% of our teachers. So we are doing well, but we have a large gap, obviously. And what we've been talking about for years is how are we clear? How do we then provide support for school leaders to make sure that when we've been clear about expectations that they can meet them? And then what does accountability look like? And accountability can look, in this case, on a spectrum of soft accountability to harder accountability, from saying just conversations about reports to school committee, about kind of internal reporting of school leaders about setting goals for the diversity of their staffs, and then are they meeting them or not. Kind of the other end of the spectrum is, John, we've had many conversations about, is this documented in an evaluation somewhere? And so we are thinking about our evaluation system. How do we ramp up to a place where this is documented as progress that is to be celebrated because we know it's good for students? Or if it's an area of growth, how does that get documented, and then what are the actual consequences? So that is continuing work that I'm excited to say that we are getting sharper on.
So in looking at the time, I think this is going to actually conclude our question and answer opportunity, though I'm sure that we're all happy to answer questions after this or at another time if they continue to be in your minds. So thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. If you're like me, you're wishing that we could just bar the door and keep going with this conversation, because I think this has been a rich discussion about the role and the voice of principals. I've heard a lot about clarity and trust as being critical components of leading successful schools. I've heard a lot about the need for inclusivity when we think about it from a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, but also how are we thinking broadly about students, about teacher leaders, and of course, principal voice. And I've heard a lot about support and accountability. And so we need to hold each other accountable for providing the supports to the adults in the building and for the student outcomes as well. And so I could go on because I thought this was amazing. So thank you both to our presenters and to our panelists. And Jen, thank you for facilitating such an interesting conversation. We are going to send you off at 10:30, as is our practice. We do end on time, but we have a special treat for you, which is we have our Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education who will share with us his thoughts on principal leadership and where we are today with schools and schooling. So Jeff, if you would come on down.
I have no intention of keeping the 10:30 deadline. There was 6 times in the emails where it said to be brief, so that won't be a problem. Good morning, everyone. So we've done 25 years of education reform. There's been some good things, there's been some not so good things, and it's time to figure out where we're going. We've done a lot of work on systems and structures, test scores and accountability, and I think it's right now that we pivot back after building that foundation to what I think matters most, which is what happens in the classroom every day. And so that means what's happening with the kids, the teachers, and the leaders in those schools. When we talk about the classroom, we've missed a huge opportunity because we know that the variation in teacher quality is astounding in this country compared to almost every other country. I won't talk about Finland because I'm sick of hearing about them. But even our friends to the north, the Canadians, their variation, if ours is like this, with the highest performing teachers and the lowest performing teachers, the Canadians do this, right? Because they have incredible professional development opportunities, and they allow their teachers the time and space to share best practices with each other. We used to do that a little bit when I was a kid teaching, but we've gotten a long ways away from that. And I think we need to get back into the idea that a lot of the best information is actually in those classrooms. The Massachusetts Teacher of the Year, his name is Jamil Siddiqui. He's a high school teacher at East Bridgewater High School. 20 of his former students are now teachers, 15 of whom are now math teachers in Massachusetts, like Jamil Siddiqui. And his only complaint to me when I talk to him at length is, I never have the time to talk to any of my colleagues. What are we doing? We need to plug that man into every new math teacher's head, right, for the next 10 years. And yet we haven't allowed that to happen. And so how do we as an education space make sure we have the time and start pivoting in that direction to give people the time to share those best practices? Diversity is an issue as well. I heard some of Emily's statistics that she was talking about the Boston Public Schools, but across the Commonwealth, 40% of our students are students of color, and yet only 8% of our teachers are. That's shocking. And we know the research is pretty clear that a student of color that sees just one teacher that looks like them has significantly better life outcomes. And yet we've not done a good job of going out to recruit and bring in great people to help us. And so we need to work on that. There was a lot of talk I heard today about autonomy, and when I went to Lawrence, there were people that were very concerned about autonomy because they thought it was going to be a free-for-all, and it actually wasn't that. And what I like to refer to it as is bounded autonomy, where we do have some parameters set in place. There's always going to be things that are going to be held constant or inviolate, special education, there's certain forms that the state needs. But we did want to give our people as much autonomy as possible to run their ship as they saw fit. And so what we did was, first and foremost, we cut 40% of the central office and put those resources back down at the school level with the kids and the teachers. I should have cut more because when I cut 40%, I did not feel 1 ounce of pain. I'm telling you the truth. And we put those resources down, and then we said, we're going to change our orientation at the central office from you work for us to we work for you. Our job is to support you. As a principal, 90% of my job was spent trying to make sure my teachers' lives were easier. As a superintendent, 90% of my job was trying to make sure that the principals' lives were easier. And in my new role, I hope 90% of my job will be to make sure that the superintendent's lives are easier. So what can we do to help support our people who are doing the work with our children every day? And how do we get there? And so in Lawrence, if you were a high-flying principal doing well, most of the time, we left you alone. We only asked one question: what do you need? Other than that, we got out of your way. And then there were some people that needed a little bit more help to get to level 1 or wherever we were trying to get to. So they got a little bit more help. And then there were some people that were struggling, and they got a lot more help. In education, we like to say that we talk all the time about differentiated instruction. And I'm not sure exactly we do that in education, but everybody talks about it. What we actually tried to do in Lawrence was differentiate the supports so that people that were doing well just were kind of left to their own devices to continue to do well and to innovate. The best principals just want one thing: to be left alone, right? And to get other people up to that place. We have to recognize that all leaders are also in this continuum. Some are at the top, some are at the bottom. It doesn't mean we need to fire everybody. It just means we need to train people up and give them the time, space that they need to develop so we have better outcomes for our kids. At the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, what do we believe? Massachusetts has been busy for the last year and a half, almost breaking its arm, patting itself on the back for being #1 on various metrics. But if you look marginally closer at the data, you'll see what the report from John King and other folks said, which is we're only #1 for some. We have kids that aren't being given the services and help that they need. Second language learner kids, children with special needs, kids of color, kids living in poverty. Our job is to use a laser-like focus to make sure that all of our children are succeeding at high levels. And we are failing many of our kids. And so what we need is this laser-like focus to get back on what really matters so that all of our kids have the opportunity at the American dream. I grew up in a Marine Corps household with the only human being I've ever been afraid of, which is my father. And he believes deeply in this idea of a meritocracy, that if you work hard enough, anyone can be or do anything they want in this country. But that actually only works if all kids start in the same place. And what we know is kids aren't starting in the same place. If all of our kids were starting in the same place when they were 18 years old, then we would have a meritocracy. We've got a long way to go. Thank you for your time. Let's get back to work.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all of you. Have a good day.